BIB10 with Off Goes the Light, taken from the brand new album, which is BIB10's 10th record. It's called BIB10. And BIB10 is songwriter and producer Stephen James Wilkinson from Wolverhampton. His sound is perhaps most associated with the intersection between folk, psychedelic and electronic music, but it also includes instrumental hip-hop, soul, funk and even R&B, and crucially all of it is rooted in the guitar. Just as he releases his celebratory 10th album, I'm delighted to say that he joins me now. Stephen, you're very welcome back to the programme.
Thank you.
Tell us about the track we just heard, Off Goes the Light. We're going to talk about the difference between the two records, Ribbons and this one. So, I mean, was it a starting point? Because it's the opening track of the album. Was it a starting point?
No, it wasn't. It wasn't one of the first tracks I made for the album. I can't remember exactly when it was made. It seemed to fit in with the new kind of aesthetic that I was going for. Even though this album's quite varied, when I came up with this tune, it fit right in there. So,
is this a celebratory record?
It feels like that for me. I think when I realised that this was the 10th album, I wanted to make something that felt like more of a celebration in a way. And I wanted it to be a bit more pop, a bit more polished and more, more kind of upbeat in places.
And does it feel like a landmark? I mean, there's a nod to that in the album title, but does it feel like a landmark for you?
I think so, yeah. I look back at my discography and how long I've been doing this, and it seems like a long time, but other times it doesn't. Other times it just feels like I'm just getting started. So,
you mentioned, looking back through your discography, have you indulged in a little bit of, reflection on the musical journey so far?
I do that occasionally, yeah. I think each album I'm borrowing ideas from my own catalogue. So with this album, I think there was some kind of intention to not revisit Ambivalence Avenue, but take some ideas from that.
I know that when you sat down to work on Ribbons, you were exploring certain instruments as well. You were exploring cello and viola and violin. Were there any instruments that you sat down with this time around, or that characterised the sound of this record as you were working on it?
Well, there are some new additions. There's a bit of soprano sax, which was, my first saxophone was an alto sax, and I wouldn't necessarily call myself a saxophonist, but I play, bits of saxophone in my music. And then I bought a tenor saxophone as well. I bought a tenor saxophone. So I think it's just tenor and soprano on this album. So they're kind of new voices, if you like.
One of the things we talked about the last time we met was how you're a self-taught musician, and you mentioned saxophone there. You talked about tenor and alto. As a self-taught musician, how do you bring that in? Do you have to go through months and months of learning the instrument before you use it, or what way does it work for you?
Obviously, there's the initial when you get a new instrument. It depends on what it is as well. So violin was a whole new thing, which is still probably one of the most difficult things that I've experienced. Trying to play violin and cello as well. Very, very different instruments. Even though they're stringed instruments, they're very different.
So do you find song ideas inside the instrument?
Yeah, music tends to come out of me when I've got an instrument. I don't have melodies and things like that in my head necessarily. I have technical ideas, production ideas, sound engineering ideas. They're the things that I think up without anything in front of me. But melodies, even lyrics I don't necessarily think up lyrics. They tend to come out while I'm in my studio with a track and just kind of sing, usually gibberish, and then it somehow starts to morph into meaning.
How important was Prince in your thinking for tracks like SOL and Potion?
I think the term musical genius gets overused, but he's definitely one. He's more than a musical genius. I mean, he could do everything. But yeah, I was particularly in love with, and still am in love with, his second album. And in fact, when I was working on Soul, the first version I did was slower, and I remember really liking it. But I because I'm quite a chilled person, I have this tendency to kind of make music a bit slower sometimes, and then I realised that this needs to be faster, so I re-record it in a different BPM. And I was thinking, what's the perfect BPM for a track like this, for a kind of live disco track? So I actually took one of the tracks off I can't remember which one it was, took one of the tracks off the second album and checked out what the BPM was using a BPM counter, and I thought, right, that's my BPM. So it's a really random BPM, like 117.882 or something. So that was, I kind of sampled I didn't sample his music, but I sampled his timing. And it felt perfect. It felt like the perfect BPM.
How do you approach lyrics?
So they're generally not preconceived. I don't have like, I want to write a song about this and then think about how I'm going to approach it. They come from nowhere, really. They seem to come from nowhere, but of course they don't come from nowhere. They come from life experiences, which includes films I've seen, things that people have said, or because I don't really read books, I'm not much of a reader, but I've read some books that were quite significant, but it's a mystery to me really where lyrics come from. And I remember watching an interview with Paul Simon, and he was talking about Mrs. Robinson, and I think he said something like, at the time he didn't really know what they meant. He said, but it will mean something. And that was very reassuring for me, because I thought, okay, it's not just me that does that. It's not just me that writes a song and then sees what the meaning is after.
I'm going to circle back to something you mentioned there, because I'm sure that fans of Bibio will be curious. But you mentioned you're not much of a reader, but you have read certain significant books. Can you pick out one for us just to let us know, give us a window into something that's had an impact on you?
Years and years ago, but I read Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman. I remember, the reason why I don't read books much is because I don't really have it's not like I don't have a good attention span, it's like I don't have a good attention. I get distracted with my own thoughts. So when I read a book, when I read just text, I can find myself getting to the bottom of the page and not absorbing any of it, because my mind went somewhere else. And it might be that my mind went somewhere else triggered by something that I was reading. And I find it frustrating, because then I have to go back and read the whole thing again. With Leaves of Grass, a friend of mine told me about it, and he was saying that he kind of dips in and out of it, almost randomly, choose a page and just read like a paragraph, and then it's like, it can kind of nourish you for the day. But I felt that I should read it cover to cover, so I did. And then after that, I kind of just flicked through it and picked certain things. But there were very powerful messages and concepts in there that went on to influence not just my lyrics, but even the artwork to Vignette in the Compost was a result of reading Leaves of Grass.
Very often we were talking about the contrast between your records, and there can be a pattern sometimes. If you look back through your career, there's a pattern, and I think it comes from the fact that you do that contrast between albums. But there's also another pattern, and it is that there will often be a follow-up EP or mini album which is from the same, I suppose, creative hinterland of a particular record. We had Sleep on the Wing just after Ribbons. Can we expect that for the new album?
That's exactly what's happening right now. Some journalists might kind of treat it as like, oh, these are the tracks that didn't make it to the album, but that's not actually the case. They're being written right now after the album was mastered. So what feels best for me is that I just make the music that I'm most excited about making, rather than overthinking it, rather than thinking what I should be doing, or I think if I just get into the flow of whatever's interesting me at that point in time, then it's going to be the most honest thing that I can do.
On that point, I mean, you've released ambient records, psych folk records that are more weighted towards funk, soul and disco. How important is it for you to change lane and not get stuck in a particular genre for a long period of time?
It keeps things kind of fresh for me if I, move on to something else for a while. I mean, with the ambient thing, with the Phantom Brickworks aspect of what I do, that's sort of like, so that's always kind of ongoing while I'm making these other albums. But I have to be in the right mood to do those, and then when I am, I don't just tend to make one track. I tend to make an album's worth, and then from that I might pick one. Sometimes I don't even pick one, and that's how Phantom Brickworks is compiled. It's sort of more like a photo album. I mean, I suppose all albums are kind of like photo albums in a sense, but there's this ongoing aesthetic, if you like, with Phantom Brickworks. That's a continuous thing where the other albums that I do can be anything and can jump style or whatever. I feel like Phantom Brickworks is a bit more, it's got a sound, it's got a style, and it will continue to have that.
You mentioned photography there, you mentioned the photo album. idea. I follow you on Instagram, and I love your photography. I was intrigued to notice that there was a whole sequence of photographs in Ireland last year, particularly Kerry and the Dingle Peninsula. Were you on holiday, or were you spending time working on the new album there?
It was just a holiday. I'd wanted to go to. I'd only ever been to Dublin for gigs, and doing gigs is never really a good way of seeing a place because you're busy, you know, and then you tend to leave prematurely. But I'd always wanted to go to the West Coast for some reason. I don't know why, because I don't really know much about Ireland, and you know, I just knew that. Well, actually, a friend of mine, his family from Sligo, he was the one that suggested Dingle. He'd been there, so I thought, okay, that'll do. I just need somewhere to aim for. So we got the train and the ferry to Dublin, and then train all the way across Ireland, which is a great way to travel because you see what the country looks like, really. And it's interesting because I'd seen, obviously, you see Ireland in pictures, and you see Ireland in films and stuff, and it, in many ways, the landscape's quite similar to parts of Britain. But it's not until you get up close that you realise that it's, especially the West Coast, that it feels very different. The foliage and the details, you know, it's so from a distance, you know, you could mistake parts of it for Scotland or Wales, but it's definitely got its own, you know, vibe, which was unbelievably beautiful place. Really, so I'm looking forward to going again, and we didn't get too wet, so we were quite lucky.
I don't know how you managed that. You'll have to share your secret on that one. But 10 records in, if you could go back to just before your debut album, is there any advice that you would whisper to your younger self?
No, I don't think I would, really. You know, sometimes I feel like I shouldn't have worried about things. You know, I shouldn't worry about what I should be doing and just do it. But I think part of some of that worry, some of that kind of anxiety is representative of passion. I'm totally cool with the idea that there might be people out there that like certain things that I do, but not the whole picture. You know, some people might like the folk stuff alone, and some people might like the pop stuff alone, and then there are people that like the variety, and that's all good for me.
Stephen, it's been a joy talking to you as always. Thank you so much for joining us in the programme. We started with Off Goes the Light. Could you choose one that we should play out with?
Let's go with the closer. Let's go with Fools.
Stephen, wonderful talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yep, thanks for having me.